They called her the forgotten Omega, blind, weak, unworthy of notice. Yet in a hall filled with power and pride, one mistake placed her in the seat no one dared touch, beside the Alpha King himself. And instead of casting her out, he claimed her before all, silencing centuries of tradition. But was it fate that guided her trembling steps, or the hidden truth her grandmother once whispered, that darkness holds more sight than the eyes ever could? What secret gift lies within this blind Omega? And why did the Alpha King risk everything to keep her at his side? Evelyn Winters was 19 years old, and already the pack had decided her place in life. A blind Omega, soft-spoken, dependent, fragile. That was what they whispered about her. Those whispers carried through corridors, drifted across training fields, and settled into the marrow of her days. Every time she passed by, the air grew heavy with pity or scorn. She felt it all. But what they didn't know was her world was not as empty as they believed. Where others saw nothing in the dark, Evelyn lived in it. Darkness was her oldest companion, her truest teacher. She could hear everything. The soft shuffle of paws dragging in the dirt, the uneven rhythm of a breath hidden behind false laughter, the way voices cracked when lies dressed themselves as truth. Her world was a map of sound, scent, and silence, a place no one else could enter. And in that hidden place, Evelyn was not weak. She was sharper than any of them knew. Her grandmother had told her once, long ago, when the nights were long and her heart was small enough to break at every cruel word. Truth will always find you in darkness, my little wolf. Evelyn never forgot those words. They rooted deep inside her, like seeds planted in the soil of her soul. When the world tried to blind her further with cruelty, she clung to those words and learned to trust what her other senses revealed. She trusted the tone behind words, the weight behind footsteps, the silence that spoke louder than any sentence. But even knowing the truth, whispers still hurt. Even when she could sense the venom hidden beneath smiles, it still stung to know she was unwanted, different, forgotten. Every Omega had their place. They served, they obeyed, they stayed in the shadows. But Evelyn, she was forced even deeper into those shadows because blindness was an extra chain on her shoulders. No one looked at her and saw possibility. No one said, okayed at her, and saw choice. Yet she still longed for a hand that didn't guide her out of duty, but held her out of love. Longed for a voice that didn't scold her, but whispered her name like it mattered. Longed for belonging. But belonging was not meant for her. At least, that was what the pack reminded her every single day. When they spoke of the upcoming mating ceremony, they never spoke to her. The air buzzed with excitement whenever the event was mentioned. The she-wolves giggled and dreamed of strong mates and glittering futures. The young men boasted about who would be chosen and who would not. But Evelyn sat in silence. Her name never entered their conversations. Their words brushed past her like cold wind, sharp and uninviting. They didn't even consider her. Why would they? A blind Omega had no place in the glitter of destiny. She was a background shadow, not a centerpiece of fate. Yet inside her chest, Evelyn's heart still beat with quiet rebellion. She did not say it aloud. She did not dare. But she thought it. I want to be seen. I want to be chosen. Just once. The night of the ceremony arrived. Her sister Mara tossed her a gown. Old, faded, the threads frayed at the edges. Here, this will do, Mara said, her tone absent, already lost in her own anticipation. Evelyn ran her fingers over the fabric. It smelled faintly of lavender, though dulled by time. It wasn't beautiful, but it was something. She smiled faintly, even if no one saw it. Her hands moved to her neck, brushing against the silver pendant that rested there. Her grandmother's gift, the only possession that truly belonged to her. The pendant was etched with faint runes, worn smooth by her touch. Every time Evelyn held it, she remembered warmth, wisdom, and the voice that told her she was more than her weakness. It was her shield, her reminder. She fastened it carefully, fingers steady though her heart was not. That pendant was the only courage she could carry into the unknown. Her breath trembled. Her pulse raced. She knew what awaited her in that hall. Whispers, stares, pitying eyes. But she also knew something else, though she couldn't explain why. Something was different tonight. The air itself seemed to hum. The night carried a weight she couldn't name. She smoothed the gown across her frame, lifted her chin, and took a careful step forward. Each footstep echoed with a rhythm she'd learned to trust, steady, certain, unafraid. She would not let them see her stumble. Not tonight. The laughter outside the hall grew louder. The scents of roasted meat and spiced wine drifted toward her. She heard the rustle of silk gowns, the clatter of boots, the murmur of endless voices filled with expectation. Her heart pounded faster. Her hand closed tightly around the pendant. Truth will always find you in darkness. She whispered the words beneath her breath, as if her grandmother still stood beside her. The words steadied her, lifted her, reminded her she was not walking alone. Tonight she would walk into a hall that was never meant for her. Tonight she would enter as a shadow, unseen and unwanted. But fate was already waiting, waiting in silence, waiting to rewrite her story. And Evelyn Winters, the forgotten Omega, was about to take her first step toward destiny. The hall was alive with music and murmurs, velvet notes spilling from the strings of the court musicians, silk hems brushing against polished stone floors, wolves and humans mingling in uneasy harmony under golden banners that shimmered with candlelight, each flame dancing like restless hearts. And Evelyn stayed near the edge of it all, her fingertips lightly grazing the cool wall, grounding herself against the tide of noise, her head tilted to catch the hum of excitement that swelled and shifted like a rising storm. Whispers wove through the air like threads of smoke, hushed voices laced with awe and fear. The Alpha King is here. He has come. Dominic Blackwood has arrived. His name rippled across the hall like thunder rolling down mountains, carried from lip to lip, and even without sight, Evelyn could feel the way the room bent around it, how bodies straightened, how laughter stilled, how breaths caught in throats unprepared for his presence. They said he ruled with an iron hand, that his decrees shaped the destinies of entire packs, that his gaze was as cold as winter frost clinging to stone, and that a single word from him was law none dared to defy. Evelyn had heard such tales since childhood, painted in tones of awe and terror, but stories could never capture what she felt now, the sudden shift in air pressure, the magnetic pull that pressed against her skin, steady, commanding, inescapable. He had entered. She knew it without a whisper to guide her, without the scrape of boots or rustle of a cloak. She simply felt the weight, a gravity unlike any other, a presence that filled the hall until every corner quivered with silence. One by one, the crowd bent at the waist, heads lowered in reverence, the rustle of skirts and the creak of leather kneeling filling the golden chamber like a single rehearsed note of devotion. But Evelyn did not bow, not out of defiance, but because her sightless eyes lifted toward where she felt him most, unafraid, curious, listening to the steady drum of his heartbeat as if it spoke louder than the voices around him. In that vast hall of worship, she alone tilted her head, sensing not just power, not just dominance, but something else hidden beneath the armor of command, loneliness. A king draped in adoration, yet hollow in its shadow. How could a man worshipped by all feel so utterly alone? She breathed in carefully, tasting the scents that drifted with his arrival. Crisp cedarwood, steel sharpened by battles fought, smoke from distant fires clinging faintly to him, and beneath it all, a quiet note of sorrow. Ow, muted but real, like rain on forgotten stone. The air pressed close to her chest, and she steadied herself with her grandmother's pendant, her thumb brushing its silver curve, its familiar ridges reminding her of the truth spoken long ago. Darkness holds more than fear, it holds the truth. Around her, whispers spun faster, voices threading together in disbelief. He looks even stronger than the stories. His eyes, they could freeze rivers. The Alpha King never smiles. Evelyn listened, but her gift cut through gossip to the pulse of hearts beating near him. Most trembled with fear, some pounded with hunger for his approval, others skipped with envy. But his beat was steady, slow, a controlled rhythm that betrayed weariness more than wrath. She leaned into the wall as a swirl of gowns brushed by, the air sharp with perfume. But her ears followed the sound of boots striking stone, deliberate, unhurried, echoing with authority as Dominic Blackthorn crossed the floor. Each step was measured, each pause long enough to command attention, each movement speaking of a man who knew every eye belonged to him. She imagined the way the golden banners might sway in his wake, the way his shadow stretched across the marble like a living crown. The musicians faltered, caught in awe, their strings trembling into silence until only the echo of his presence remained. Evelyn's heart quickened, not from fear, but from the uncanny awareness that though she stood hidden against the wall, though she was no one to this crowd, his attention had brushed against her, like a flame grazing the edge of her world. It startled her, that invisible touch, as if he could sense her the way she sensed him. She lowered her lashes, her fingers curling tightly around the pendant, though her face remained calm, composed, refusing to mirror the quivering excitement that shook the rest of the room. Somewhere close, a woman's voice rose in breathless worship, praising his strength, his beauty, his dominance. Yet Evelyn heard in the king's silence a refusal to be moved by their admiration. He carried it like armor, heavy and cold, his solitude hidden beneath applause. Why then, she wondered, did her chest ache with the thought that perhaps, behind the crown, he longed for someone who could truly see him, not with eyes, but with something deeper? She shifted her stance, pressing her shoulder to the stone wall, listening harder, feeling how the space between them seemed to narrow though no step had been taken. It was impossible, she told herself. He was a king, and she was the forgotten Omega, a blind girl standing in the shadows. Yet still, when the hall exhaled in awe and reverence, Evelyn alone whispered in silence to her heart, "Why does the Alpha King, adored by all, feel like the loneliest soul I have ever touched?" The hall seemed wider now, a space where laughter and whispers curled together like smoke, filling every corner with judgment. Evelyn could not see, but could feel burning against her skin. Each chuckle a knife, each murmur a weight pressing against her ribs, and she clutched her grandmother's pendant tighter, as though it might shield her from the sharp edges of their scorn. But even silver could not silence cruelty, and Lady Serena's voice, sharp as broken glass, had already cut the air open, spilling mockery across the floor for all to hear, and Evelyn forced herself to walk, to move, to let her fingertips brush the polished wall as though it were a guide, though truly it was her courage she was guiding, one trembling step at a time, because if she faltered, if she bowed her head, then Serena would win, and Evelyn had already spent too many years bowing to shadows, so she lifted her chin, even though her eyes saw only endless night, and she kept walking, her steps slow but steady, the rhythm of her breath louder to her than the music that still swelled in the distance, strings and drums that no longer sounded festive but cruel, a backdraw. P to humiliation, and still she walked, ignoring the hiss of silk dresses brushing past, ignoring the subtle coughs of men who thought she should have stayed in the corner where Omegas belonged, ignoring the laughter that broke like brittle wood behind her back, and she thought of her grandmother, thought of her voice whispering, "Truth will always find you in darkness." And she clung to that, even as darkness pressed closer around her, and the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine swirled in her senses like a storm she could drown in. But she held steady, pressing forward, until her hand met the curve of a chair unlike any she had touched before, carved and cold, its surface grand and smooth, and she stilled, her breath catching in her throat, for even without sight she knew this was not just any seat. This was something important, heavy with presence, heavy with history, heavy with power, and she hesitated only a moment, only a heartbeat, before her fingers tightened against the wood and she lowered herself into the chair, willing her knees not to tremble, willing her hands not to betray her fear, willing herself to appear as though she belonged, though every whisper in the hall screamed otherwise. And then she felt it. Not the chair, not the room, but him. The presence beside her, vast and commanding, like a tide that could drown kingdoms or lift them to the stars. A weight that pressed against her senses, steady and certain. And she knew, before anyone spoke his name, before the hush fell across the hall like a blade cutting through sound, she knew it was the Alpha King, Dominic Blackthorn, seated beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body even through the thick air, close enough that her heart stumbled against her ribs as though it had forgotten how to beat, close enough that every whisper, every gasp, every stunned silence crashing through the hall like a wave told her she had made a mistake no one would forgive. And yet even in the swell of dread, even in the storm of humiliation rising around her, Evelyn did not move. She did not flee. She did not bow her head, because something in her told her to stay. Something in her gift whispered that truth lived in this moment, and truth had brought her to the Alpha King's side, though the hall might never forgive her for it. The silence that followed her mistake was not empty, it was alive, alive with the weight of eyes, alive with the pounding of hearts, alive with the hunger of gossip that would carry this moment far beyond these golden walls. And Evelyn felt it all pressing against her skin like a storm pressing against glass, fragile and ready to shatter. Yet she refused to break. She lifted her chin just a fraction, letting her unseeing eyes face the hall as though she were unafraid, though her breath was tight and her hands trembled where they rested in her lap, and somewhere to her left she heard the low hiss of Serena's laughter, poisonous and sharp, delighted that Evelyn had stumbled into ruin. But Evelyn would not give her the satisfaction of trembling more, and so she pressed her thumb against her grandmother's pendant until it left a mark, grounding her, reminding her that strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply refusing to run, and yet the air grew heavier still, because beside her the Alpha King did not speak. Not yet, though his presence rolled over her like thunder before rain, and the hall waited, every breath held, for his judgment, for his fury, for the crack of his voice that could cast her out, humiliate her further, or worse, and Evelyn felt the edges of fear cut into her resolve. But she stayed because she could also feel something else in him, something beneath the power, something quiet and aching that no one else seemed to notice, a loneliness that pulsed faintly like a hidden wound. And she dared to wonder, even as sweat dampened her palms, if perhaps she was not the only one out of place here tonight. And that thought gave her strength enough to sit straighter, to fold her trembling fingers neatly in her lap, to breathe slowly through her nose as though she were calm, though her heart still battered her, chest like wings against a cage, and the hall shifted, the music faltering, voices hushed, until she could hear the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. And then a murmur spread, names whispered like prayers or curses. Dominic Blackthorn, the Alpha King, ruler of all packs, the man whose word was law, whose gaze was said to freeze weaker wolves where they stood, and she sat beside him now, blind Omega, fragile and overlooked, a girl meant to vanish into corners. And yet here she was, daring to exist in his shadow, daring to breathe the same air, daring to occupy the seat no one would have imagined for her. And though her mind screamed at her to rise, to flee, to apologize, her body stayed rooted, as if destiny itself had locked her to the chair, and she wondered if perhaps it had. If perhaps every cruel laugh, every mocking whisper, every lonely night had led her here, to this moment, to this table, to this silence so sharp it carved her name into the memory of all who witnessed it. And still she waited for his voice, waited for his judgment, waited for the Alpha King to decide her fate. A murmur spread like a sudden wind stirring through tall grass, soft at first, then swelling, a ripple of disbelief that moved across the hall as wolves and humans alike tried to understand what they were seeing, and someone gasped, sharp and startled, as though Evelyn's mistake had cracked the sacred order of the ceremony in two, and others waited, breathless, for the inevitable fury of the Alpha King, the wrath that was said to be colder than winter, sharper than steel, but instead of rage, instead of condemnation, a voice rose, deep and steady, rich as earth and thunder, and it carried not anger, but something else, something curious, something controlled, and that voice spoke a single word that stilled the hall more than silence ever could. "Stay," he commanded, and Evelyn's lurched against her ribs so violently she thought the entire hall might hear it, and she swallowed hard, her lips parting, the apology trembling out before she could stop it. I'm sorry, I didn't know." But again that voice came, cutting through her words, softer this time, yet firm enough to shatter every thought in her mind. "I said stay." And the sound of it settled over her like a cloak, not cruel, not mocking, but resolute, protective in a way she did not expect, and his tone, though commanding, carried an undercurrent of warmth, as if her mistake amused him, as if her presence intrigued him rather than shamed him, and his next words, spoken low enough for the hall to hear, yet meant only for her, drew gasps from every corner of the chamber. "It seems you found the only seat worth sitting in." And the scandal of it rippled outward like fire racing across dry leaves, voices breaking into shocked whispers, sharp breaths, and startled laughter that wasn't laughter at all but disbelief. And Evelyn's cheeks burned hotter than flame, her skin prickling as though 1,000 eyes pierced her all at once. And yet amidst the storm, the king's presence did not falter, his weight beside her steady, his energy a shield against the scorn aimed at her. And then she felt his hand, firm and deliberate, guiding hers toward the cool rim of the goblet that sat before her. His touch steady, unhurried, as though this were not humiliation, but instruction, as though he had chosen this moment to teach her something no one else would ever dare. "You hold it like this," he murmured, his voice low, coaxing, carrying the patience of someone who had lived too long among those who never truly listened, and his hand lingered just long enough to steady her trembling fingers, just long enough to make her breath falter, before he withdrew, leaving behind the ghost of warmth that made her skin ache. And she lifted the goblet carefully, doing as he showed her, the rim pressing cool against her lips, and she drank, the faint sweetness of wine coating her tongue, and the silence of the hall deepened, not one voice daring to laugh now, not one whisper daring to cut her down, because no one laughed when the Alpha King himself commanded otherwise. No one mocked what he had chosen to shield, and Evelyn's mind reeled, her heart unmoored, because she understood in that breathless pause what should have been impossible, what every instinct had told her could never be true. Dominic Blackwood, Alpha King of all the packs, feared and revered, was not humiliating her, was not casting her out, was not tearing her apart for daring to sit where she should not. He was protecting her. He was placing his shadow over her like a barrier. He was turning the cruelest mistake of her life into something else entirely, something dangerous, something powerful. And as the weight of his words echoed in her chest, Evelyn realized the night had shifted, the ground beneath her no longer steady, and whatever path she had walked before this moment, it was gone now, burned away by the single, impossible truth that the Alpha King had spoken for her. The hall breathed like a living thing, filled with whispers that slithered through the golden-lit chamber, and though music still lingered faintly in the air, it no longer sounded joyful, but cautious, as though the very strings of the violins quivered under the tension that had rooted itself at the high table. And in that uneasy quiet, Dominic's voice rose again, not with the sharpness of command that subjects had come to fear, but with something softer, curious, and heavy with an edge of vulnerability that made even the air pause, his words reaching only for the girl at his side. "What do you hear in this room?" And Evelyn's lips parted in surprise, for never had a king, let alone the Alpha King, asked her a question that felt less like a test and more like an invitation, and for a moment her hands trembled where they rested on the smooth, carved wood of her chair, her grandmother's pendant warm against her chest, a reminder that truth was a gift even when it wounded, and she turned her head slightly as if to listen deeper, the blind girl whose ears drank in the world others ignored, and she let the overlapping sounds sift through her, feet tapping nervously against the marble, laughter that rang false, breaths held as if afraid to release, until the pattern revealed itself, and she spoke slowly, each word trembling but unshakably honest. Fear, envy, loneliness. And the effect was immediate, for though she did not raise her voice, the syllables carried farther than she knew, striking hearts like stones against glass, peeling away the masks of those who glittered in silks and jewels, and around her the hall seemed to flinch, as if she had uncovered a secret they fought desperately to bury beneath the surface of celebration. And beside her, Dominic's frame shifted, the weight of his silence pressing like a storm gathering in the distance, and she could not see him, but she could feel the tension ripple through him, the sudden stiffening of muscle, the way the air itself seemed to tighten around his broad shoulders. And though others might have faltered under such a change, Evelyn did what came naturally to her, reaching not with sight, but with touch, her hand trembling as it brushed against the back of his, and at once a spark of awareness flared between them, subtle yet undeniable, and in that moment her strange gift stirred like an ancient echo, whispering truths into her chest that she had not asked for but could not deny. And when her lips moved again, the words were softer, more dangerous, like secrets spilled in the dark. Strength, weariness, a man who wants to be seen, not as king, but as himself. And though she spoke gently, the impact was thunderous. For Dominic, Alpha King of 1,000 loyalties, Ais, conqueror of rivals, ruler whose word shaped the law of every pack, felt the unguarded strike of her perception, and for once he had no shield, no iron mask to hide behind, and silence blanketed the high table, stretching unbearably, as if even the torches bent low to hear what would follow. And into that fragile stillness he breathed words so low they sounded like a confession to himself rather than to her. "You see more than anyone here," his voice roughened, cracked at the edges like stone weathered by rain. And Evelyn's heart twisted at the vulnerability laced in that murmur, for it was not the Alpha King who spoke then, but a man stripped bare, and she wanted to answer, to tell him she had always seen more in shadows than others did in light. But before her voice could rise, the delicate thread that bound them was cut harshly by another, and into the hushed chamber came a tone soaked with poison. Prince Cyrus, Dominic's younger brother, his words as sharp and gleaming as the dagger strapped to his side, venom curling through every syllable. "Brother, you shame us with this charade. An Omega? Blind? She doesn't belong at your side." And though the words were directed at Dominic, they lashed across Evelyn's skin like a whip, reopening every wound carved by years of whispers. Every moment she had been reminded she was lesser, fragile, disposable, and around the hall the embers of cruelty reignited, some eyes flashing with smugness, others with fear, as though the challenge Cyrus hurled was not only at his brother, but at the strange bond forming here. Yet before the fire of his insult could spread further, Dominic's response came, not in icy dismissal, not in soft contradiction, but in a thunder that cracked through the rafters, his voice carrying the authority of storms and kingdoms. "She belongs where I say she does." And his words shook the very marrow of the pack, his authority brooking no argument, his tone not only silencing his brother, but searing the truth into the hall itself, and Evelyn's breath caught as if the air itself had abandoned her lungs. Freigal. Or in that single declaration he had done what no one had ever done before, claimed her, not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone worthy of his side. And though her cheeks burned with the heat of countless eyes fixed upon her, though fear nipped at the edges of her fragile courage, beneath it all bloomed something reckless and wild, a fragile hope daring to grow in the barren soil of her life, a hope that perhaps she was no longer invisible, no longer unwanted, no longer forgotten. And as the music faltered and the crowd wrestled with the weight of what had just been spoken, Evelyn sat with her hands trembling in her lap, feeling the steady pulse of the king's presence beside her like a flame she could not turn from. And in that fire, she felt both the danger of standing too close and the impossible sweetness of finally being seen. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as Dominic's thunderous words still echoed through the vaulted chamber, silencing every whisper, every murmur, every cruel snicker that had been aimed at her. The air seemed to thrum with the power of his voice, as though the very walls had bent in acknowledgement of the Alpha King's command. Yet beneath that roar of authority, she could still feel it, the faint tremor of unease that rippled through the assembly like an undercurrent beneath calm waters. Wolves who moments ago had laughed at her were now frozen, unsure whether to bow deeper or to stare in disbelief at the Omega girl who had somehow become the center of the night. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the silver pendant at her throat, the edges cool and grounding against her skin, as though her grandmother's spirit reached through it to steady her pulse. She did not know how she had found herself here, seated beside a king, defended by him against his own blood, but she knew one thing with startling clarity: the world would never look at her the same way again. The music that had once filled the hall with an easy rhythm faltered, strings quivering to silence, as if even the musicians were afraid to continue without the king's approval. Dominic did not look away from her. His gaze, though unseen by her blind eyes, pressed against her like a weight both daunting and strangely comforting. She could feel the heat of it, the unwavering steadiness that told her he was not ashamed of his defense, nor was he second-guessing his choice. His presence filled every corner of her awareness, and though the hall was crowded with nobles, rivals, and counselors, in that moment there was only him and the echo of his words wrapping around her like a shield. Prince Cyrus's outrage still lingered in the room, but even his venom seemed small compared to the king's declaration. Evelyn could almost taste the bitterness rolling off him, sharp and acrid, like smoke clinging to the air after fire. She lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in an instinctive attempt to mask the tremble in her lips. Courage was not the absence of fear. Her grandmother had once told her that, but the decision to keep moving even when fear tried to root you to the ground. And so, with her heart hammering, she remained seated at the high table, unflinching, though her entire body screamed to run, to disappear into the shadows where no one could laugh at her again. The silence stretched unbearably long, broken only by the faint clinking of goblets as nervous hands fumbled for distraction. But Dominic did not allow it to settle into weakness. His voice came again, lower now, smoother, yet carrying the same unyielding edge of authority. "No one," he said, "will speak of her worth as though it were theirs to decide." The hall inhaled sharply, 100 voices caught in collective disbelief. Evelyn could sense the ripple of shifting emotions around her: fear, envy, awe, fury. And yet beneath all of it, she found one truth that startled her most. Not everyone here despised her. A few sparks of admiration burned in the crowd, faint but real, hearts, whispering that perhaps the king's choice was not madness, but something bold, something extraordinary. It was a fragile discovery, one she tucked close to her chest like a secret flame to warm her trembling bones. Dominic shifted slightly, his arm brushing hers in the smallest of gestures, and though the touch was fleeting, it anchored her as firmly as if he had wrapped her hand in his. Evelyn straightened her spine, her lips parting in a breath she did not realize she was holding, and for the first time that night she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was not an intruder at this table, not a mistake waiting to be corrected, but someone chosen, someone seen. The silence in the hall deepened, thick as fog, until the scrape of a chair leg rang out louder than thunder, and Evelyn knew before anyone spoke that Cyrus was not finished. His anger was a living thing, sour and restless, prowling just behind his carefully masked smile, and when his voice came, it dripped venom sweetened with mockery. "So this is what the great Alpha King has been reduced to," he sneered, his tone carrying across the hushed chamber, "choosing an Omega who cannot even see the crown she would disgrace by touching. Gasps spread like wildfire, sharp and cutting, but Evelyn did not flinch. She felt every word burn across her skin, yet before the sting could root itself in her chest, Dominic's hand shifted closer to hers, not touching, not claiming, but steady, a promise in its restraint. His voice lashed through the hall, cold and absolute. "Careful, Cyrus," he said, and the edge of steel beneath his calm tone made the air itself shiver. "You forget yourself." For the first time in her life, Evelyn sensed fear radiate from someone other than herself. Cyrus's heartbeat quickened, uneven, though his words did not falter. "I forget nothing," he spat. "I remember the laws, the traditions, the bloodlines that made us strong. You would break them all for her?" His contempt struck at Evelyn like stones hurled in the dark, but before she could recoil, the king's voice rose again, quieter now, but no less commanding. "I would break 1,000 traditions to honor truth," he said, "and if any man here doubts my right to choose, let him stand and say so now." His challenge rang through the chamber, daring, unrelenting, but none rose, none spoke. The silence itself bent beneath his will, and Evelyn felt the tide shift ever so slightly, from ridicule to fearful respect. Still whispers curled like smoke at the edges of the room, and she could feel the weight of envy, the heavy glares that pressed against her like stones piled on her back. She wanted to shrink beneath them, to vanish into the cracks of the stone floor, but Dominic's nearness anchored her, a reminder that she was not standing alone against the storm. He leaned closer then, his breath brushing her ear, low enough that only she could hear. "Do not bow your head to them," he murmured. "You are not less than any soul in this room." The words shivered through her, fierce and unfamiliar, like warmth pressing into a place long frozen. Her lips trembled, but she lifted her chin, and though her eyes saw nothing, her posture spoke for her. She would not cower. Across the hall, Cyrus growled low in his throat, but his protest was cut short when the heavy doors groaned open at the far end of the chamber. A hush swept once more as the Queen Mother entered, her presence as commanding as any king's. Evelyn felt the shift in the room immediately, the drop in prideful shoulders, the scent of awe tinged with fear, and though she had never met the woman, she sensed power radiating from her, old and deep, threaded with wisdom. The Queen's steps were deliberate, her gown whispering against the floor, and when she spoke, her voice carried not with volume, but with certainty. "Enough," she said, and the word alone silenced even Cyrus. Evelyn's breath hitched as the Queen came closer, her aura brushing against her like a tide, eyed steady and knowing. "I know who you are, child," she said softly, though her words carried to every ear in the hall. "Your grandmother walked beside me once, when the world was younger and our enemies many. She was a seer, blind to the world's face, but never to its truths, and she passed that gift to you." Evelyn's heart lurched, her fingers curling tight around the pendant at her throat. Gasps rippled again, but this time not of mockery, of recognition, of fear, of dawning understanding. The Queen's words struck through every doubt like lightning splitting a storm. Evelyn was not an accident, not a shameful mistake to be hidden in shadows. She was the granddaughter of a seer, her gift carved by blood and destiny. Dominic's hand, at last, settled fully over hers, not as command, but as affirmation, as if to tell the world he had known, or perhaps had simply believed, from the very first moment. Cyrus's fury cracked, spilling from him in a bitter hiss, but the Queen's gaze, sharp as steel though Evelyn could not see it, cut him into silence. The hall no longer breathed scorn, it breathed awe. Evelyn, trembling but unbowed, lifted her chin again, and her voice, small, steady, certain, rose in answer. "I am not nothing," she said, and the words, though simple, rang out with a resonance she had never known her voice could carry. The hush that followed was absolute, a silence that felt like the earth itself pausing to listen. Dominic's hand tightened once, proud and protective, and when he spoke, his words sealed the night. "You see her now," he declared, "and you will remember this moment. For tonight, an Omega stood unbroken, and I chose her. And though the hall was filled with wolves and nobles who would whisper and plot long after, in that single heartbeat no one dared to speak, because the truth had been spoken, and truth could not be undone. The hall doors burst open, with a force that made every candle tremble, the flames bending as if bowing to the storm that had just walked in. And all at once the laughter, the whispers, the cruel murmurs fell away like leaves, scattered in a sudden wind, for it was not a guard, nor a servant, nor a herald that had entered, but Dominic himself, the Alpha King. And though Evelyn could not see him with her blind eyes, she felt him in every breath of the room, his presence cutting sharper than a blade, his authority hotter than fire, and his voice when it came was not raised in rage, but carried such power that it silenced even the boldest tongue with a single word, "Enough." And that word rolled through the hall as if the stone itself echoed it, making spines stiffen, making wolves lower their gazes, making those who had sneered at Evelyn just moments before shrink into the shadows of their own shame. And as his footsteps struck against the polished floor, she felt each one like a drumbeat in her chest. Steady, deliberate, carrying him closer, until at last the air shifted beside her, and his hand, warm and commanding, reached for hers, and in front of all the gathered nobles, the high-born she-wolves, the warriors, and even his own brother, he lifted her fragile hand high, not as if it were fragile at all, but as if it were made of gold, and his voice rang out again, unshaken, undeniable. "This woman, Evelyn Winters of Crescent Valley, is under my protection." And though protection alone would have been enough to stop the cruel mouths from spitting their poison, he did not stop there, for his gaze swept the crowd like a flame sweeping dry grass, and he added, each word slow and deliberate, meant to leave no room for doubt. "More than that, I declare her my chosen courtship." And then it came, the sound of the world breaking open, gasps that rushed like wind through the hall, cries of outrage from those who thought their daughters worthy of his claim, murmurs of disbelief that crackled like thunder, and silence so thick it wrapped around Evelyn's shoulders like a cloak, her breath caught in her throat, her chest rising with the weight of a truth too heavy to believe. For he had not merely defended her, had not merely shielded her from shame, but he had chosen her, blind Omega, forgotten girl, dismissed shadow. He had spoken her name as if it belonged in the mouth of kings, and her heart hammered so hard she feared it would break free. For what did it mean, this choice? What fire had she unknowingly lit in him? What bond had she stirred? And as her trembling fingers clutched his hand tighter, she felt it, the undeniable truth of him. No lies beneath his skin, no mockery, no hidden cruelty, but strength carved in stone, hope tempered like steel, and beneath it, beneath the armor of a king who ruled with iron, she felt something softer, something that made her breath falter and her lips part in wonder, something that felt impossibly close to love. And the hall around them was not simply silent now, it was stunned, wounded pride bleeding into the air, envy dripping from every glance, rage sparking in noble hearts. And still she sat, blind but unbowed, her hand raised in his, her soul suddenly seen by the one man who was never meant to notice her, and the whispers she had heard her whole life, useless, weak, cursed, melted away like snow under the sun. Because in this single moment, the Alpha King had rewritten her story before them all. And though fear trembled through her veins, she could not deny the warmth that bloomed beside it, the fragile, breathtaking truth that fate itself had shifted, and it was Dominic's hand holding hers, as if he dared the world to challenge him. The hall doors burst open with a force that made even the flames of the golden chandeliers bend and shiver, as though the fire itself recognized the storm that had entered, and in an instant the whispers, the cruel laughter, the smug remarks died in throats that dared not finish their venom, because standing framed in the doorway was Dominic Blackwood, the Alpha King, his shadow long and commanding, his presence burning hotter than any torch, and Evelyn, though blind, felt him as surely as If her skin had learned the shape of his aura, for the air itself thickened when he walked, heavy with authority, heavy with unspoken warning, and his boots struck the marble floor with such deliberate rhythm that each sound echoed like a drumbeat of war, silencing the nobles, silencing the warriors, silencing even those who moments ago had feasted on her humiliation. And then his voice came, deep and steady. No need to roar, no need to raise in fury, for it carried through the hall like thunder rolling across the mountains, the kind that makes windows rattle and hearts falter. Enough, he said, and the stone itself seemed to hold its breath, for that single word carried weight enough to bring an empire to its knees, and those who had jeered now shrank into their silks, their eyes falling to the floor, their courage scattering like frightened birds, and Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, uncertain whether the sound was terror or relief, because never before had someone spoken into her shame and crushed it so utterly. But before she could make sense of the fire unraveling in her chest, he moved, his steps carrying him across the hall, cutting through the crowd like a blade through water, parting them with nothing but his presence. And she heard the way bodies shifted out of his path, heads bowed low, the silence a trembling thing around him, until he stood before her, and without hesitation, without a moment of doubt, his hand found hers, warm, firm, steady. And before she could even gasp at the contact, he raised her hand high into the torchlight for all to see, blind Omega, forgotten girl, dismissed shadow now standing in the fire of a king's choice, and his voice, rich with authority, rolled through the hall again. This woman, Evelyn Winters of Crescent Valley, is under my protection. The words rang through the hall like iron striking stone, leaving sparks of silence in their wake, and for a breathless moment no one moved, no one even dared to breathe, because such a claim was more than defense, it was more than a passing shield. It was the spoken will of a king, and in their world, the will of a king was law. Yet still he did not stop, for his gaze swept over the nobles, the warriors, the lords who had thought their daughters destined for his hand, the she-wolves dressed in silk who had believed their beauty would buy them a crown. And he spoke again, his tone slower now, deliberate, like a hammer striking each word into unbreakable stone. More than that, he said, and Evelyn felt the room shift, the air tighten, her very breath catch in her throat. I declare her my chosen courtship. Gasps tore through the hall like arrows, sharp and fast, some filled with outrage, some with shock, and some with fear. For never in all their scheming had they imagined this, the blind Omega, forgotten and unseen, raised to the king's side by nothing but his word, and Evelyn, clutching the warmth of his hand, trembled so fiercely she feared the room would hear it. Her lips parted but no sound escaped, because she could not understand, could not measure what was happening. Yet she felt it, truth, steady and unyielding, no mockery, no pity, no cruelty behind his voice, only conviction. And though her sightless eyes stared forward, she could feel the stares of hundreds pressing against her, some sharp with hatred, some clouded with disbelief, others darkened with envy, and beneath them all a question thrummed like a storm waiting to break. Why her? Why had the king chosen her? But Dominic did not flinch beneath the weight of their scorn. He did not release her hand or falter in his voice. He stood as though carved of stone, daring them to defy him, and Evelyn's heart pounded, not with fear of their hatred, but with the strange, dangerous warmth that tea spread inside her chest, because when she brushed her soul against his presence, she found no falsehood, no cruelty, only strength worn thin by years of rule, only weariness hidden beneath armor, and, like the softest ember of fire, something gentler, something that frightened her more than cruelty ever could, something like longing, something like love, and she wanted to weep, because for the first time in her life, someone had not only seen her, but lifted her into the light. The hall held its breath, balanced on the knife edge of silence, until the scrape of a chair and the hiss of silk broke it. And from among the crowd Cyrus stepped forward, his voice sharp as a blade, laced with venom that dripped into every word. "Brother, this is folly, a spectacle unworthy of your throne. A blind Omega? She demeans the crown with every breath she takes at your side. Murmurs rose, fueled by his poison, and for a moment Evelyn felt the press of their judgment, the weight of their sneers cutting deeper than any blade. Yet even as her heart faltered, Dominic's grip tightened, grounding her, steadying her, a silent promise that he would not let her fall. His gaze burned across the hall, his voice thundered back, low but unshakable. Enough! I decide what honors the crown. I decide who stands at my side. The floor seemed to tremble with his fury, and every whisper was strangled into silence. But still Cyrus smirked. Still the nobles shifted, their fear a mask for their hunger to see her fail, to see her cast aside, and Evelyn, sensing their malice like a wave of ice, lifted her chin, though she could not see them, her fingers brushing her grandmother's pendant, her breath drawing courage from the memory of those words whispered long ago. Truth will always find you in darkness. She did not speak, not yet, for her voice would come when the moment demanded. But her silence now was no weakness. It was defiance, it was strength, and Dominic, feeling the steadiness in her trembling hand, seemed to draw strength from her in return. Around them, the hall seethed in a storm of disbelief. But Dominic's arm never wavered, his declaration hung like iron in the air, and Evelyn knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that something had shifted forever. She had been claimed not as a prize, not as a mistake to be hidden, but as a choice made by a king before the eyes of all. And though danger crackled in the silence that followed, though enemies watched with narrowed eyes and Cyrus plotted venom in the shadows of his smirk, she felt her heart beat not with dread, but with a fragile, blooming hope, and that hope wrapped around her like light piercing through the endless dark, whispering of a fate that had only just begun. The hall lingered in silence, thick as fog, the echoes of Dominic's claims still vibrating against the stone walls, but Evelyn felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing into her skin, sharp as blades, some filled with disbelief, others dripping with envy, and more still carrying the dangerous venom of hatred barely disguised. Yet Dominic did not falter, his hand a fortress around hers, his arm anchoring her against the tide of scorn. And in that stillness she sensed something shifting, something fragile but undeniable, a seed of fate rooting deep within the soil of this moment. She stood taller though her legs trembled, drawing breath from the memory of her grandmother's whispered promise. Truth will always find you in darkness. And in that darkness, she felt it again. The steady flame of Dominic's presence, a warmth that cut through the chill of judgment. The nobles whispered still, their silks brushing, their jewels clinking as bodies leaned together, eager to plot, eager to conspire. But over them rose another voice, gentler yet carrying weight like stone in water, the Queen Mother stepping forward from her throne, her presence draped in quiet authority, and Evelyn felt the hush fall deeper still, for when the Queen Mother spoke, the Pax listened, whether they wished to or not. "Enough," the elder wolf said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "This girl you scorn is not a mistake. She is not an accident. I knew her grandmother, as some of you may remember. A woman who carried the gift of sight, though her eyes, too, were blind. A seer, a keeper of truths, a voice of destiny." Gasps rippled, sharp as knives, and Evelyn's heart stumbled in her chest, for her grandmother's secrets had been hers alone, whispered only in the dark of nights and the warmth of fires, never spoken aloud, yet here they were, revealed in the heart of the king's hall. She clutched the pendant tighter, feeling it hum against her palm, as though even the silver remembered the power it had once carried. The Queen Mother's voice did not waver. "Evelyn Winters carries that same blood, that same gift. You call her blind, yet she sees deeper than all of you gathered here." Murmurs spread again, some disbelief, some fear, and Evelyn felt the swirl of emotions like a storm crashing against her senses: envy, awe, doubt, and a shadow of fear that tasted bitter as ash. But beneath it all, she stood still, rooted in Dominic's unwavering hold, and though her cheeks burned with the weight of their scrutiny, her heart no longer cowered. The storm of whispers rose higher, like a tide trying to swallow her whole, but Dominic's grip never loosened, his presence steady and immovable, and when his voice rang out, it was not the cold authority of a king, but the unshakable conviction of a man. You doubt her because you fear her. You sneer at her because she does not bow to the mold you built. But I tell you this, Evelyn Winters is mine to protect, mine to stand beside, and you will not touch her with your poison. The thunder of his words silenced even the boldest counselors, though Cyrus's mocking laugh cut through like a blade, cruel and bitter. So the mighty Alpha King crowns himself a fool, to shatter alliances, to throw away centuries of tradition, all for an Omega who cannot even see the path before her. You damn us, all. Evelyn felt the venom of his intent before he even finished, the twist of jealousy burning hotter than truth. And she lifted her chin, though fear licked at her ribs, her gift whispering his lies into her mind. Her lips parted, her voice quiet yet clear. It is not blindness that clouds the truth here, Prince Cyrus. It is envy. You would see your brother falter not because of me, but because his strength outshines your shadow. Gasps swept through the room like wind in a forest fire, the boldness of her words striking harder than she meant. But she did not regret them, for the air itself shifted, the truth too heavy to be denied. Cyrus snarled, his composure slipping, yet Dominic only smiled, faint but real, pride threading through his aura as he squeezed her hand gently, a silent thank you for her courage. The Queen Mother's gaze lingered on Evelyn, not with pity, but with something like approval, as though she had been waiting for this very moment, the moment Evelyn would stop hiding behind silence and speak her own truth. Around them, anger still simmered, fear still curled like smoke, yet Evelyn no longer felt drowned in their judgment. She inhaled, catching the mingled scents of spiced wine, burning candles, polished stone, and the sharp tang of unease, and she thought of her grandmother's words again. Truth will always find you in darkness, and she realized with a shiver that tonight the darkness was not her curse, it was her gift, and through it she could see what no one else dared admit. The hall seemed to pulse with tension, every breath hanging between rebellion and surrender, and for one aching moment Evelyn wondered if the world itself would split under the weight of change. But Dominic broke the silence with a voice that carried not just through stone and banners, but into hearts themselves. I did not come here to uphold the hollow rituals of old. I came here to remind you that strength is not measured by sight or rank, but by spirit, and this woman, Evelyn Winters, has more spirit than any who dare mock her. His words struck deep, a hammer against walls of tradition, and though anger flickered in some eyes, Evelyn felt the threads of doubt fraying, the balance tipping. Her fingers trembled around the pendant, warmth radiating from the silver like her grandmother's hand upon her heart. And for the first time, she did not shrink from their gazes, even though she could not see them. She faced the crowd as though she were born to stand in that place. Then, soft as falling ash, the Queen Mother spoke once more. So it is decided. The Alpha King has chosen, and I, too, bear witness. The bond of truth cannot be undone by fear. Murmurs swept the hall again, but this time they were different. No longer only cruel, no longer only doubtful. Some carried awe, some resignation, and some even respect. Cyrus stormed from the chamber, his fury rattling against the walls like thunder fading into distance, yet his shadow no longer held sway, for the light of choice had burned through. Evelyn felt Dominic's hand tighten gently, guiding her to rise beside him, his strength a shield, his presence a vow unspoken. Together they walked down the length of the hall, past nobles who had mocked her, past rivals who had wished her gone, and though her heart raced like a wild drum, she held her head high, her grandmother's wisdom echoing steady within her. Truth will always find you in darkness. As the great doors opened and moonlight spilled across her face, Evelyn breathed deep of the night air, cool and clean, carrying the scent of freedom. Dominic leaned close, his voice a whisper meant only for her. You were never meant to hide in the shadows. You were meant to walk beside me. And she knew, with a certainty that silenced every doubt, that he spoke no lie. The carriages waited, the future unknown, the whispers of scandal trailing them still, but Evelyn no longer feared them. She had found her truth, and he had claimed high, heir as his. The Omega who had been forgotten had become the heart of a king, and as the doors closed behind them, the hall left stunned in silence. Evelyn understood at last that her blindness had never been her weakness. It had been her gift, the path that led her here, to this love, to this destiny, to this light that burned brighter than any sight could ever give. And with her hand in Dominic's, she stepped forward, not as the forgotten Omega, but as the chosen one.